Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes Deadly Ideologies edition.
Oh, yeah.
Today we're diving into a text that, sent shockwaves through the 20th century.
It did.
Joseph Stalin's The Foundations of Leninism.
Buckle up.
Buckle up, because this one is a wild ride.
It certainly is. And you know what's striking about this book is that it's not some dry academic treatise.
Right.
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
A blueprint for revolution aimed directly at new party recruits.
Yeah, it's almost like a how-to manual for seizing power and reshaping the world.
That's right.
So before we get into the nitty-gritty,
Sure.
can you give us a quick overview of the main themes Stalin lays out?
Absolutely.
What's the core message he's trying to hammer home?
In a nutshell, Stalin sets out to define Leninism as the only true path to revolution in the age of imperialism.
Okay.
He argues that Leninism, building upon Marx, provides both the theoretical framework and the practical tools for the proletariat to overthrow the capitalist order. He emphasizes the need for a highly disciplined, centrally organized party to act as the vanguard of the revolution.
Right.
The importance of forging alliances with the peasantry and the inevitability of a violent struggle to achieve these goals.
Yeah.
And perhaps most chillingly, he lays out the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat as a necessary step in consolidating and maintaining socialist power.
Okay, so we're talking about a pretty radical and frankly terrifying vision of the future.
Yes.
And the truly scary part is that these ideas, presented in the book as abstract theory,
Right.
would soon be put into brutal practice, shaping a century of conflict and oppression.
Exactly.
Wow.
Understanding the foundations of Leninism is key to understanding not just the rise of Stalinism, but the trajectory of communist movements throughout the 20th century.
Right, so let's dive into the text itself.
Let's do it.
Stalin starts off by setting a very specific historical stage.
He does.
He really emphasizes the context of the early 20th century, right?
He does remember this is a time of immense global upheaval. You've got burgeoning industrial capitalism creating massive wealth disparities, rampant imperialist expansion fueling international tensions,
Right.
and simmering class conflict threatening to boil over.
Oh.
And then, of course, you have the eruption of World War I, which throws everything into even greater chaos.
So Stalin is basically saying that Leninism emerged as a direct response to this incredibly volatile and unstable period.
Yes.
Like the old ways of thinking, the more moderate forms of socialism,
Right.
just weren't cutting it anymore.
That's exactly his argument.
Yeah.
He paints a picture of a world teetering on the brink of collapse. A world where the capitalist system has reached its final stage, what Lenin called moribund capitalism, ripe for overthrow by the proletariat.
Right.
And he argues that Leninism, with its emphasis on revolutionary action and the need for a disciplined vanguard party, is the only theory and practice capable of guiding the proletariat to victory.
And he really singles out Russia as the prime location for this revolution to kick off, right?
He does.
What was it about Russia that made it such fertile ground for these radical ideas to take root?
Well, Russia at the time was a hotbed of social unrest.
Okay.
You had widespread poverty, a corrupt and autocratic czarist regime, and a growing working class increasingly radicalized by harsh working conditions and economic inequality.
Yeah.
Plus, Russia was a key player in World War I, which only exacerbated these existing tensions.
So it's like all these historical forces converge to create this perfect storm for revolution.
Yeah,
And Lenin, according to Stalin, was the one who saw the opportunity and seized the moment.
precisely. And Stalin argues that it wasn't just a matter of being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Lenin's genius, he claims, was in developing the theoretical framework, the strategy, and the tactics that would allow the Bolsheviks to successfully harness this revolutionary energy and ultimately seize power.
Okay, so we've got the historical backdrop.
We do.
Now let's talk about the nuts and bolts of Leninism itself.
Let's get into it.
Stalin spends a good chunk of the book outlining what he sees as Lenin's distinct method. What sets Lenin apart from other socialist thinkers of his time?
Well, Stalin repeatedly contrasts Lenin's approach with what he sees as the dogmatism and complacency of the Second International,
Okay.
a socialist organization that advocated for gradual evolutionary change within the existing system.
Right.
Stalin claims that these folks were all talk and no action content to debate abstract theories, while the capitalist machine continued to grind on exploiting the masses.
So for Lenin, and by extension for Stalin,
All
it's
right.
not about theorizing or waiting for some inevitable historical process to unfold.
No.
It's about actively pushing for revolution, about taking concrete steps to hasten the downfall of capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. Stalin emphasizes this idea of testing theories in the crucible of the revolutionary struggle.
Yeah.
It's all about action, about judging parties and individuals not by their words, but by their deeds.
And he provides some pretty concrete examples of what he means, right?
He does.
Like how to assess the conditions for seizing power. The strategic use of a general strike as a revolutionary tool, and the constant need for self-criticism within the party to weed out complacency and ensure ideological purity.
Yes, all of this underscores the idea that for Leninism, revolution is an active process, a constant struggle, not some far-off utopia you just wait around for.
Which leads us to one of the most controversial and frankly terrifying aspects of this ideology,
Okay.
the theory of revolution itself and its inevitability.
Right.
I mean, Stalin doesn't mince words here.
He doesn't.
He's basically saying that a violent clash between the proletariat and the capitalist powers is not just likely, it's unavoidable.
That's right. And he spends quite a bit of time outlining Lenin's contributions to Marxist philosophy, arguing that a successful revolutionary movement needs a solid theoretical foundation.
Right.
He critiques what he calls the spontaneity of the labor movement.
All right.
The idea that revolution will just erupt organically without the guiding hand of a disciplined, ideologically driven party.
So for Lenin, it's not enough for the working class to be angry and exploited.
No.
They need to be organized, educated, and directed by a vanguard party that understands the historical forces at play
Right.
and can strategize accordingly.
Precisely. And that vanguard party, of course, is the Communist Party, with its iron discipline, its unwavering commitment to the cause, and, as we'll see, its willingness to use any means necessary to achieve its goals.
And this brings us to another key theme that runs throughout the book,
Yes,
the role of the party.
it is crucial.
Stalin really hammers home the point that the party is not just a political organization.
Right.
It's the embodiment of the will of the proletariat, the
Yeah.
driving force of the revolution.
He does. And he lays out a very specific vision of what this party should look like.
Yeah.
Highly centralized, hierarchically structured, and utterly devoted to the principles of Leninism. There's no room for dissent,
Right.
for questioning the party line,
Yeah.
for individual ambition that might threaten the unity and effectiveness of the movement.
It's a pretty chilling vision, especially when you consider what this kind of rigid top-down control would mean in practice once the party actually seizes power.
It is, and that's what makes the Foundations of Leninism such a fascinating and, frankly, disturbing read.
Right.
It lays bare the ideological underpinnings of a system that would ultimately lead to unimaginable suffering and oppression.
Okay, so we've got this highly disciplined, ideologically driven party poised to lead the proletariat in a violent revolution against the capitalist powers.
Right.
But then we come to this seemingly paradoxical concept,
Okay.
the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Uh-huh.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like a contradiction in terms, right?
It does.
How can you have a dictatorship in the name of the people?
That's a question that has haunted Marxist-Leninist thought from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And Stalin's explanation, as you might expect, is not exactly reassuring.
Right.
He argues that the dictatorship of the proletariat is a necessary but temporary stage following the revolution. It's a tool, he claims, for crushing the bourgeoisie, for suppressing any counter-revolutionary forces, and for restructuring society along socialist lines. He even suggests that this period of control could last for decades.
So it's not about establishing a democracy in the traditional sense, with free and fair elections and all that jazz.
Not quite.
It's about consolidating power in the hands of the party, which supposedly represents the will of the people, even if those people don't have a direct say in how they're being governed.
Exactly. And Stalin goes to great lengths to contrast the dictatorship of the proletariat with what he calls bourgeois democracy, which he dismisses as a sham designed to mask the true power dynamics at play.
Right.
He argues that true democracy can only exist under socialism, where the means of production are owned by the people and economic exploitation has been abolished.
But the reality, of course, turned out to be very different.
It did.
The Soviet Union under Stalin became a textbook example of totalitarian rule with widespread repression, state-sponsored terror, and a complete disregard for individual rights and freedoms.
It did. And that's why it's so important to read the Foundations of Leninism with a critical eye, understanding the historical context, the ideological biases, and the ultimately tragic consequences of the ideas it espouses.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've got the historical backdrop, the core tenets of Leninism, the role of the party, and the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right.
But there's one more piece of the puzzle we need to explore,
Okay.
the role of the peasantry.
Uh-huh.
And this one, at least on the surface, seems to contradict the whole Marxist framework, doesn't it?
It does seem like a bit of a head-scratcher at first. After all, Marxism is all about the urban proletariat,
Right.
the industrial working class rising up to overthrow the capitalist system.
Right.
So where do these rural farmers, these small landowners, fit into the picture?
Exactly. It's like, aren't they supposed to be on the other side of the class divide?
Well, this is where Stalin gets into some very specific historical and economic arguments that are specific to the Russian context.
Yeah.
He claims that unlike in more industrialized Western nations, the Russian peasantry had a revolutionary potential.
Interesting.
He argues that they were alienated from the liberal bourgeoisie, represented by the Constitutional Democratic Party, or cadets, and were therefore open to an alliance with the proletariat.
And he points to some concrete examples to support this claim, right?
Yes.
Like the role of the Russian parliament
Yeah.
in raising the political consciousness of the peasantry and turning them against both the Tsar and the cadets.
Right. He paints a picture of the Russian peasantry as being crushed by poverty, land, hunger, and exploitation at the hands of the landed aristocracy.
Wow.
He argues that they've been radicalized by their experiences, pushed to the point where they're ready to join forces with the proletariat in a revolutionary struggle against the existing order.
So basically he's saying that while the peasantry might not be ideologically pure Marxists, their material conditions, their lived experiences, make them natural allies in the fight against capitalism.
That's the gist of his argument. And he goes on to explain how after the revolution, the peasantry will be gradually integrated into a socialist system through carefully managed economic policies.
Okay.
Of course, the brutal reality of how that played out under Stalin with forced collectivization and the Holodomor famine is a story for another time.
Yeah, that's a whole other level of darkness that we'll need to unpack later.
Indeed.
But for now, let's stick with Stalin's theoretical framework.
Okay.
We've talked about the peasantry within Russia, but he also dedicates a good chunk of the book to the national question on a global scale, right?
He does, and this is where we see him grappling with the complex relationship between national liberation movements and the broader goal of worldwide socialist revolution.
Right.
He's highly critical of what he saw as the reformist approach of the Second International, which he claims failed to grasp the revolutionary potential of national struggles against imperialism.
So he's basically saying that these more moderate socialists were too focused on achieving incremental reforms within individual nations.
Yeah.
And not thinking big enough, not seeing the global picture.
Exactly. Stalin argues that the struggle against capitalism is inherently international, that the proletariat of all nations must unite to overthrow their oppressors.
Mm-hmm.
And he sees national liberation movements, particularly in colonized countries, as playing a crucial role in this global struggle.
But he doesn't just blindly endorse every nationalist movement that pops up, right?
No, he's very clear about that.
Okay.
He distinguishes between what he calls reactionary nationalism, which he sees as a tool of the ruling classes to maintain their power,
Got it.
and revolutionary nationalism, which aims to overthrow imperialist domination and create the conditions for socialist revolution.
So it's all about supporting the right kind of nationalism.
Yes.
The kind that weakens the capitalist powers and advances the cause of global proletarian revolution.
Precisely. And this is where we see a real tension in Marxist-Leninist thought, a tension between the universalist ideals of internationalism and the particularities of national identity and struggle.
And that tension would play out in all sorts of complicated and often tragic ways in the decades to come as communist movements around the world grappled with the challenges of balancing national liberation with the goal of international socialist solidarity.
Yes.
But we'll save that conversation for another time.
We will, but before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's important to highlight another key theme that runs throughout the Foundations of Leninism.
Okay.
The distinction between strategy and tactics.
Yeah, Stalin really emphasizes this, doesn't he?
He does.
It's like he's approaching revolution as a military campaign with a clear understanding of the need for both long-term planning and short-term maneuvers.
He defines strategy as the overall plan, the long-term goals of the revolutionary movement.
Okay.
While tactics are the specific actions taken to achieve those goals, adapting to the ever-changing circumstances.
Right.
He argues that both are essential for success.
And he provides a ton of examples from the Russian Revolution itself, right?
A ton.
Like how the Bolsheviks had to shift their tactics at various points, from focusing on overthrowing the Tsar to ending Russia's involvement in World War I to ultimately consolidating Soviet power.
That's right. He uses these historical examples to illustrate the importance of carefully analyzing the relation of forces at any given moment, exploiting the enemy's weaknesses, and choosing the right time to strike.
Wow.
He even talks about maintaining what he calls the moral ascendancy, which basically means winning over the hearts and minds of the masses, ensuring that the proletariat sees the party as the true champion of their interests.
So it's not just about brute force, it's also about persuasion propaganda and shaping the narrative in a way that favors the revolutionary cause.
Exactly. And this is where Stalin's own skills as a propagandist, his ability to simplify complex issues and present them in a way that resonated with the masses, really come into play.
Okay, so we've got the strategy, the tactics, the disciplined party, the revolutionary potential of the peasantry, and the complex dynamics of the national question.
We do.
Are we missing anything?
Well, there's one more element that I think is worth highlighting, something that might surprise some listeners.
What's that?
Stalin's discussion of style in work.
Style and work. That sounds a bit unexpected, coming from the guy who's basically laying out a blueprint for a totalitarian state.
It does.
What's he talking about here?
Well, it's not about fashion choices or anything like that.
Okay,
What Stalin is getting at is the way in which a revolutionary party should operate,
right.
the attitude and approach its members should adopt.
Hmm.
He advocates for a blend of what he calls Russian revolutionary sweep and American efficiency.
Okay, now that's a strange combination.
It is an odd pairing.
What exactly did he mean by that?
He meant that a successful revolutionary party needs to combine bold vision and decisive action with pragmatic organization and a focus on concrete results.
Mm-hmm.
He criticizes both empty revolutionary posturing, what he calls communist vainglory,
Okay.
and narrow-minded practicalism, which lacks a broader historical perspective.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between idealism and pragmatism,
Yes.
between inspiring the masses and actually getting things done.
Exactly. And you can see how this emphasis on efficiency, on achieving measurable results, would become a hallmark of Stalin's own rule, even if those results often came at a horrifying human cost.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've got a pretty good grasp of the key themes and arguments Stalin lays out in the Foundations of Leninism.
We do.
But I think the real question, the one that lingers in the back of our minds as we read this text, is how these seemingly abstract theoretical concepts translated into the brutal reality of Stalin's regime and the Soviet Union.
That's the question, isn't it?
How did these ideas, warped and twisted though they may have been, shape the course of the 20th century, for better or for worse?
That's the question we'll be grappling with in the next part of our deep dive.
Oh boy.
We'll explore how the ideas laid out in this book, however distorted or misinterpreted they may have been, paved the way for one of the most repressive and deadly regimes in human history.
It's a chilling thought, but one that we can't shy away from.
Yeah.
Understanding the past, even the darkest chapters, is essential if we want to avoid repeating the mistakes that led to such unimaginable suffering.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the most important takeaways from this deep dive.
Yeah.
The Foundations of Leninism isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked power, the seductive allure of utopian ideologies, and the need for constant vigilance in defense of individual liberty and human rights. What's fascinating here is how these seemingly abstract ideas in the Foundations of Leninism actually paved the way for the very real and very brutal policies of Stalin's regime.
Right. It's like we're tracing a roadmap from theory to terrifying practice. I mean, you can't deny the devastating impact this ideology had on millions of lives.
Absolutely. Stalin took those core principles we discussed, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the suppression of dissent, the ruthless pursuit of socialist transformation, and turned them into a system of widespread repression, forced collectivization, and state-sponsored terror.
You know, when we talk about the dictatorship of the proletariat, it's easy to get lost in the abstract terminology.
It is.
But what did that actually look like on the ground in the everyday lives of Soviet citizens?
Well, imagine a society where a single party, the Communist Party, has absolute control over every aspect of life, political, economic, social, even cultural.
Wow.
Any opposition, real or imagined, was brutally crushed, often through the secret police.
And this control wasn't just limited to political opponents, right?
No, it was
I mean, we're talking about entire groups of people being targeted, intellectuals, artists, religious leaders, even entire ethnic minorities.
That's right. Stalin saw anyone who didn't conform to the party line as a potential enemy, a threat to the revolution. He used the state apparatus to eliminate those threats, often through imprisonment, exile, or execution.
Wow.
It was a system built on fear and paranoia.
Okay, so we've got this atmosphere of fear and repression.
Right.
But Stalin wasn't content with just silencing dissent, was he?
He was not.
He also wanted to completely reshape Soviet society to force it into his vision of a socialist utopia.
He did.
And that's where the whole forced collectivization of agriculture comes in, right?
Exactly. Stalin viewed private ownership of land as a fundamental obstacle to creating a truly socialist society.
Okay.
He saw the peasantry, even those who had initially benefited from the redistribution of land after the revolution,
Yeah.
as clinging to bourgeois ideas of individual ownership and resisting the collective good.
So he decided to force them into collective farms,
Yes,
essentially stripping them of their land and forcing them to work for the state.
he did.
And if I remember correctly, this didn't go down too well, did it?
It was a catastrophe. Millions of peasants were forcibly removed from their land, often deported to remote areas or sent to labor camps.
Wow.
Those who resisted were branded kulaks, a term used to demonize wealthy peasants, though in reality it was often applied to anyone who opposed collectivization.
And this whole campaign, which was supposed to modernize agriculture and increase production, actually backfired spectacularly, didn't it?
It did. The peasants who had generations of experience working their own land were suddenly thrust into a system they didn't understand and deeply resented.
Right.
The result was a catastrophic drop in agricultural output, which contributed to one of the worst famines in human history, the Holodomor, which killed millions in Ukraine.
It's just mind-boggling how an ideology that claimed to be about liberating the working class could lead to such widespread suffering and death.
It is, and it's a stark reminder that good intentions, even when wrapped in the language of progress and equality, can be twisted into instruments of oppression and brutality.
So we've seen how the foundations of Leninism, as interpreted and implemented by Stalin, had devastating consequences within the Soviet Union.
Right.
But its impact wasn't limited to Russia, was it?
It was not.
I mean, Stalin saw himself as the leader of a global communist movement.
Absolutely. Stalin's version of Leninism, with its emphasis on world revolution and the inevitability of conflict with capitalist powers, shaped the course of global politics for decades.
Wow.
It fueled the Cold War, inspired communist movements and revolutions around the world, and led to countless proxy wars and regional conflicts.
I remember reading about how Stalin viewed the Soviet Union as the vanguard of the global communist movement,
Yeah.
a model for other countries to emulate.
Yes, he actively supported communist parties and revolutionary movements in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America, providing them with arms training and financial support. This led to the establishment of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, China, Cuba, North Korea, and elsewhere.
And many of these regimes, often modeled on the Soviet system, brought with them their own forms of repression and human rights abuses.
They did. While the specific conditions and historical contexts varied from country to country,
Yeah.
there were some disturbingly common threads: suppression of individual liberties, single-party rule, the use of secret police and state-sponsored terror to maintain control,
Right.
and a rigid adherence to an ideology that left little room for dissent or individual expression.
It's like Stalin's interpretation of Leninism created a blueprint for authoritarianism that was exported around the globe with tragic consequences.
Yes, and the legacies of those regimes, both positive and negative, are still being grappled with today.
Now, it's easy to focus on the negative aspects of Stalinism,
Of course.
and rightfully so.
Right.
But I'm curious, is there anything in the foundations of Leninism, any ideas or concepts that have had a more positive impact?
That's a great question.
Can we salvage anything from this ideology, or is it just a toxic brew from start to finish?
That's a really important question and a tough one to answer.
Yeah.
It's undeniable that some of the ideas espoused in the book, taken in isolation and stripped of their historical baggage,
All right.
could be seen as having a progressive bent.
Okay.
For example, the emphasis on social equality, the critique of capitalist exploitation, the call for international solidarity.
Right. Those ideas on their own have inspired countless movements for social justice, labor rights, and human rights.
They have. But it's crucial to remember that those ideas are always presented within a very specific ideological framework, one that ultimately justifies violent revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Right.
And that's where things get very complicated very fast.
Right. It's that classic dilemma of the ends justifying the means.
Yes.
And in the case of Stalin's interpretation of Leninism, the means were so brutal, so totalitarian, that they ultimately undermined and in some cases completely contradicted the very goals they claimed to be pursuing.
Exactly. It's like trying to build a paradise on a foundation of blood and terror.
Right.
It's simply not sustainable in the long run.
So if we zoom out a bit,
Sure.
what does this all tell us about the nature of ideology itself? are the dangers of utopian thinking,
Yes.
but the potential for even the most well-intentioned ideas to be twisted and used for nefarious purposes.
That's a profound question and one that deserves a lot of careful consideration. I think one of the key takeaways from this deep dive is that ideology, however appealing or seductive it may seem, can never replace critical thinking, nuanced analysis,
Right.
and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths.
Right. It's about recognizing that no ideology has all the answers, that no system is perfect,
Right.
that human beings are complex and fallible, and that power in any form always carries the potential for abuse.
Precisely. And that's a lesson that's just as relevant today as it was in Stalin's time.
Now, I'm curious from your perspective, what stands out as the most surprising or unexpected aspect of the Foundations of Leninism? Was there anything that challenged your preconceived notions about this book, about Stalin, or the ideology itself?
You know what surprised me most was the level of detail and almost obsessive focus. Stalin devotes to the practical aspects of revolutionary strategy and tactics.
Yeah.
He clearly had a keen understanding of military principles of logistics, organization, discipline.
Which makes sense, given his background as a revolutionary and his role in the Russian Civil War.
Right.
It's like he was constantly thinking several moves ahead, always analyzing the situation, looking for weaknesses to exploit,
Yes.
for opportunities to seize control.
Exactly. And that strategic thinking, coupled with his ruthlessness and unwavering belief in his own cause, made him a formidable and ultimately terrifying leader.
One thing that really struck me was his insistence on the need for a highly disciplined, centrally controlled party.
Yeah.
He seems to see any form of dissent or internal debate as a weakness, a threat to the unity and effectiveness of the movement.
That's a crucial point, and it helps explain why the Soviet system under Stalin became so totalitarian, so intolerant of any opposition. He saw the party as an instrument of his will, a tool for shaping society according to his vision.
Right.
And any cracks in that unity, any challenges to his authority were perceived as existential threats.
It's almost as if he couldn't grasp the idea that healthy debate, dissent, even disagreement can actually strengthen a movement, an organization, a society.
Yes, and that inability to tolerate dissent, that obsession with control, ultimately poisoned the Soviet system from within.
Now, beyond the obvious brutality and repression, I'm curious about the more subtle ways in which Stalin's interpretation of Leninism shaped Soviet society.
Okay.
How did this ideology seep into people's everyday lives, their relationships, their sense of self?
Well, one of the most insidious impacts was the creation of a culture of fear and suspicion.
Right.
People were constantly being watched, monitored, reported on. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Children denounced their parents. Colleagues betrayed each other out of fear or opportunism.
It's like the whole fabric of society was warped by this pervasive paranoia.
Yes.
It must have been incredibly isolating and dehumanizing.
It was, and it led to a stifling conformity where people were afraid to speak their minds,
Wow.
to express any opinions that deviated from the party line, even in private.
Right.
This created a chilling effect on creativity, critical thinking, and genuine human connection.
And this fear extended beyond the political realm, didn't it?
It did.
I mean, Stalin imposed this rigid doctrine of socialist realism on all forms of art, literature, music, even science.
Absolutely. Art and literature were seen as tools of propaganda meant to glorify the achievements of the revolution and inspire the masses.
Okay.
Anything that didn't fit this narrow definition, anything that was deemed too abstract, too individualistic, too critical, was labeled bourgeois or decadent and suppressed.
So you couldn't even escape into the world of art or imagination without encountering the long arm of the state, the ever-present gaze of the party.
That's right. Artists, writers, musicians, filmmakers, scientists, anyone who dared to express themselves outside the narrow confines of Stalinist ideology risked persecution, censorship, imprisonment, or worse.
It's amazing how an ideology that claimed to be about liberating humanity could end up being so restrictive, so suffocating to the human spirit.
It is one of the great ironies of history, and it's a reminder that the road to hell, as they say, is often paved with good intentions.
Okay, so we've explored the devastating consequences of Stalin's interpretation of Leninism, both within the Soviet Union and on a global scale.
Right.
But I think it's important to step back for a moment
Okay.
and ask ourselves, how should we, as modern readers, approach the foundations of Leninism? Is it just a historical artifact, a relic of a bygone era, or is there something more we can glean from it?
That's a crucial question. I think it's essential to approach this book with a critical eye.
Yeah.
recognizing the historical context in which it was written and the ultimately tragic consequences of the ideology it espouses.
Right.
But at the same time, it's a valuable historical document, one that provides insights into the mind of one of the most influential and controversial figures of the 20th century.
Right. It's a window into the thinking that shaped a totalitarian regime, a system that brought untold suffering to millions.
It is.
But it's also a reminder of the enduring power of ideology,
Yes.
of the dangers of utopian thinking, of the need for critical thinking and skepticism in the face of any claims to absolute truth or authority.
Precisely. And those are lessons that are just as relevant today as they were in Stalin's time.
So what does this all mean for us? For how we understand the world, for how we engage with political ideas, for how we guard against the seductive allure of ideologies that promise simple solutions to complex problems?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think one of the key takeaways from this deep dive is the importance of informed skepticism, of questioning assumptions, of being wary of any ideology that claims to have all the answers.
Right. It's about recognizing that the world is a messy, complicated place,
Yes, it is.
and that there are rarely easy solutions to complex problems.
Exactly. And it's about remembering that ideas have consequences, and that those consequences can be profound, even deadly.
We need to learn from the mistakes of the past,
Yes, we do.
to be aware of the dangers of unchecked power, of the seductive allure of ideologies that promise utopia but deliver tyranny.
Absolutely. And that's a responsibility we all share.
Well, this has been a truly sobering and thought-provoking exploration of the foundations of Leninism. We've unpacked a lot of complex ideas and confronted some very dark chapters of history.
We have. But in doing so, I think we've gained some valuable insights into the nature of ideology,
Yeah.
the complexities of power, and the importance of critical thinking and vigilance in defense of human freedom.
I completely agree. Now, in our final part, we'll delve into the enduring legacy of Stalin's ideas and explore how they continue to resonate, for better or for worse, in the world today. We're back, and, after that deep dive into the darkness of Stalin's regime, it's tempting to think, well, that was then, this is now.
Right.
But the big question is,
Yeah.
what about the legacy of Stalin's reign? The foundations of Leninism? Can we really say its influence has completely vanished?
That's the challenge, isn't it? On the one hand, the Soviet Union collapsed. Communist regimes around the world crumbled. It seems like Stalin's ideas should be relegated to history books. But I think it's more complicated than that.
So you're saying even though the Soviet Union is gone, the ghost of Stalin, so to speak, is still lurking around?
In a way, yes. Those core ideas in the foundations of Leninism about power, the role of the state, the justification of violence for political goals, those didn't just disappear overnight.
Okay, so where do we see those echoes of Stalinism today? What should we be watching out for?
Well, one place is in the tactics of authoritarian regimes even now. Think about it: suppression of dissent, controlling the media, demonizing opponents, using propaganda and disinformation. These are straight out of Stalin's playbook.
And it's not just overt dictatorships, is it?
No, it's not.
We're seeing some pretty illiberal trends popping up even in democratic societies.
Exactly. The erosion of democratic norms, attacks on a free press, the surge of populism and nationalism, these trends echo themes from the foundations of Leninism. The idea that the ends justify I and we means sacrificing individual liberties for some supposed greater good, concentrating power in the hands of a few. These are dangerous ideas, and they can take root anywhere.
It's almost as if Stalin's ghost isn't just haunting dictatorships, but whispering to those who want to weaken democracies from the inside.
That's a chilling thought, but there's truth to it. We have to be vigilant, recognize the warning signs, and actively defend the institutions and values that protect our freedoms.
Now, going beyond politics, are there other areas where we see the shadow of Stalin's ideas?
One subtle but important area is intellectual discourse itself. This idea that certain viewpoints are off limits, that debate should be shut down, dissent equals betrayal, that has a distinctly Stalinist ring to it.
And that's really dangerous, isn't it? The free exchange of ideas, even challenging ones, is essential for a healthy society.
Absolutely. We need to push back against any attempts to silence dissent, create spaces where open and honest debate is not just allowed, but encouraged.
This has been such a thought-provoking deep dive into a truly complex and disturbing book.
It has been.
What are the key lessons we should take away from the foundations of Leninism?
Well,
What wisdom can we carry with us as we navigate the 21st century?
I think the most important lesson is the danger of blindly accepting any ideology, no matter how appealing it may seem.
Right, remembering that ideas have consequences, And those consequences can be world-changing, even devastating.
Exactly. Cultivating a spirit of critical thinking, questioning assumptions, being willing to challenge those in power, defending the values of freedom and individual liberty, that's the antidote to falling prey to dangerous ideologies.
Powerful lessons indeed. This deep dive into the foundations of Leninism has been a sobering reminder of how fragile democracy can be, how tempting authoritarianism is, and how vital it is to be vigilant against those who would chip away at our freedoms.
I couldn't agree more. As we go forward, it's crucial to learn from the mistakes of the past, to be active participants in shaping a future where individual liberties are protected, dissent is respected, and the darkness of Stalinism is never allowed to return.
Well said. And on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive. I hope you found this exploration as thought-provoking as we have. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the spirit of critical thinking alive.